Hello and welcome to IPRI's podcast series. I'm your host Hamza Rifat Hussain. I'm an assistant research associate at the Islamabad Policy Research Institute. I'm also a television anchor by profession. Today we're going to be speaking about India's nuclear non-proliferation record. India is often touted as the world's largest democracy. It's considered to be one of the largest economies in the world. It exhibits immense amount of clout as far as international organizations is concerned. But is India really a responsible nuclear weapons state? For that, we need a historical background. We need to analyze contemporary trends. We also need to look at how responsible the BJP government, or the Congress government for that matter, has been with regard to ensuring that India maintains a stellar record as far as nuclear non-proliferation is concerned. My guest today is Dr. Adil Sultan. He's the Dean of the Aerospace Sciences and Strategic Studies Department at Air University. Mr. Adil Sultan, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
So let's start off with India's nuclear weapons program in general. If we go back into history, started in 1974, and we talk about Indira Gandhi's policy priorities for that matter. And we've also had this label with the Indian nuclear weapons program that it was Smiling Buddha. But do give us a realistic check as to what the Indian nuclear weapons program was all about.
Thank you. I think that's the interesting time to evaluate India's nuclear program. In the backdrop of the current controversy between Canada and India, because India's nuclear weapons program, in fact, started with the Canadian assistance. Although the research reactor that the Canadian provided in 50s, the Cyrus reactor and the fuel that was provided by the United States, India was supposed to use it for peaceful purposes, but they extracted plutonium from the same Cyrus reactor and they built nuclear weapons, and they tested it in 1974 and labeled it as peaceful nuclear explosion. Subsequently, Indian scientists, they have themselves written, now it's a public, there was nothing peaceful about that 1974 Buddha test. But the interesting thing is, recently in the backdrop of this controversy, that's why I said, some of the Indian analysts, they were threatening Canada with nuclear strikes, that India can send 8 submarines and Canada would be wiped out. So someone jokingly commented, yes, the program that the Canadians started is going to haunt them or bite them back. So this is how the politics is. So India's nuclear weapons program, it was started on a wrong footing. It was supposed to be for peaceful nuclear uses, but they used it for weapons development, and subsequently whatever India did, it's very evident. So it's not about India bashing per se, but historically and objectively, if you analyze, India had been cheating on many fronts. So the start was, as I said, was from the research reactor that was provided mainly for peaceful purposes.
Right. So when we talk about that, are there some concrete examples that we can actually quote where India has maintained a more aggressive posture as far as nuclear weapons is concerned, particularly with regard to South Asia?
Definitely, the nuclear posture of India is mainly poised against Pakistan. They continue to say that they are developing their nuclear capabilities against a perceived Chinese threat. But we know it very well. China is too big for India. India and China are never going to go to a war with each other because they have more than $100 billion of bilateral trade.
Absolutely, yes.
The genesis of this program, once India started, during 50s, Chinese and Indian relations were very cordial. You must have heard about Hindi Chini Bhai
Bhai, which
so
means
there was
Hindi
no
Chini, brother, yeah.
Absolutely. And there was no justification for India to build a nuclear weapons program in 50s when Nehru laid the foundation for this dual track program where they publicly said that we are going to use it for the peaceful applications, but they were also building weapons capability at that time in 50s. And in 1958, the famous statement by father of India's nuclear program, Homi Bhabha, that given an authority or an opportunity, they can build a bomb within a few months. So whether India had the capability at that time or not, but they had the intent to eventually pursue nuclear weapons program. Why it is important that often the Western analysts and many in Pakistan, they also try to justify that, yes, India has legitimate security concerns against China, and that's why they are building a nuclear program. But the genesis was not about Chinese. It was more to do with the prestige factor.
Right.
Since all major powers, they had acquired nuclear capability, and India in the future wanted to be a major recognized as a major power, so they laid the foundation in 50s. And definitely, that's their right because the leadership, if they think India has the potential and eventually they should emerge as a regional power or global power, they have all the right to develop
Absolutely.
whatever they want
Scott
to.
Sagan, Stanford's professor, he's also written this in his book, Why Do States Build Nuclear Weapons? I mean, prestige is a factor, domestic politics is a factor. So it's not as if, a country is aggressive or, passive in nature. It's more to do with internal domestic politics to a large extent, too.
Absolutely. So his model, they principally discuss the three major factors why states acquire nuclear weapons.
Hmm.
Security, as you said, that's the most commonly given justification by all nuclear weapon states that they acquire the nuclear capability because of security
Security, right.
consideration. But if you objectively analyze, not many countries they had a existential threat of the nature that would call for building a nuclear weapons program. So prestige and domestic politics. So prestige we have already talked about in India's case. Domestic politics again. And in domestic politics, once we say the domestic politics include various interest groups, the bureaucracies, the military bureaucracy, the scientific bureaucracy, and the political leadership. You mentioned about Indira Gandhi also. Nehru was himself a strong
Absolutely.
proponent. If you read his speeches in the parliament during 50s and 60s, once China tested its nuclear device in 1964. So it is very clear that they intended to eventually build a nuclear weapons
And this
program.
came 2 years after the 1962 debacle
Yes.
for the Indians. Yeah.
Yes. So they had this intent. So domestic politics does play an important factor. In 1974, again, if we recall, Indira Gandhi's government or administration was in turmoil, so it was very fragile. So the scientific bureaucracy, they gave him the suggestion, probably if you test a nuclear device, this will build your nationalist credentials.
And political capital.
Definitely, and that's what happened. So but the justification was that it's a peaceful nuclear explosion. There's nothing about weapons, and subsequently the scientists themselves negated this perception about. So there are various factors, and these factors are true for any nuclear weapon state, even for Pakistan. So we did acquire nuclear capability because India was building one. So we did face existential challenge from India because India is a bigger country. It has more conventional capability. And the leadership in Pakistan at that time, Bhutto started this program once, so he conceived. So he was very clear that if India gets a nuclear device or
Pakistan
weapon,
has to have it.
Pakistan has to have. And that's how this famous slogan that we will build a bomb even if we have to eat grass. So,
right.
so that was the justification. But as you build bombs, the other factors also start to weigh in for all the countries. So there would be a factor of prestige, there would be a factor of domestic politics, and like we are a nuclear weapon state, and if somebody tries to even think of giving up, the domestic factors are so strong because this is owned by all the political leadership and the public. So no leader can take that decision. So that's how this is the nature of proliferation. The interest of the drivers that push you to achieve a certain capability, and once you acquire that capability, your interest can change.
So, Doc, let's move to 1998. Obviously, the BJP government is in power, and then India did test its nuclear weapons when the Vajpayee administration was actually there. So, when we look at the BJP's proclivity towards Hindutva and aggressive nationalism, and even though Vajpayee, many would argue, was cut from a different cloth than Narendra Modi is. I mean, what prompted the BJP to suddenly claim that, okay, fine, 1998, let's go ahead and test, despite the fact that China decided to, develop its nuclear weapons program in 1964? It took India 10 years in 1974 for Indira Gandhi to actually believe, okay, let's go ahead with our nuclear weapons program. What prompted the BJP government to go ahead and test in 98?
Before 1998, Vajpayee did try in 96 also.
Right.
But he was prevented by the United States because they picked up. And earlier in 95, they also attempted. Again, they were prevented by international players not to cross that nuclear threshold. BJP had very clearly included this in their manifesto that once they will come into power, they will make India a nuclear weapon state, because that's the vision that the BJP government has, that eventually India has to emerge as a Hindu nationalist country. And nuclear capability is one tool where they can project that power potential, that there is probably a Hindu bomb. That's how they see it. But in 96, Vajpayee couldn't test, reason being his government was of coalition.
Okay.
So there were pressures, so he didn't get vote of confidence, so he postponed that decision. But this was part of the BJP manifesto from the very start. So in 1990, the moment they came back into power with majority, so the first thing that they said, or the instructions given to their scientists, was prepare to test, and that's how India did. One factor that I would like to mention, why they
Yeah,
did
please go
try
ahead.
in 95 and 96, because at that time there were ongoing negotiations for comprehensive test ban treaty
Right,
under
right.
the Clinton administration. The
Absolutely.
United States was pushing very hard to have that CTBT concluded and signed and ratified. India was wary about that, that if this happens, their option for becoming a declared nuclear weapon state would close forever, probably. And that was the urgency in 95 and 96. They wanted to test. Subsequently, CTBT didn't happen because of US own domestic political dynamics. The
Absolutely. Yeah.
Senate didn't ratify, and India got the opportunity in 1998. So once India tested, there was no other option for Pakistan because we had to restore that strategic balance. Although before 1998, despite the fact that we had developed a capability, we had not declared ourselves publicly, there was a restraint. We continued to offer several proposals to India and to the international community to keep the South Asia free of nuclear weapons. So in 1987, South Asian nuclear weapon free zone,
Right.
and subsequently several proposals were given. But nobody stopped India, and once 98 happened, so Pakistan had no other choice but to cross that nuclear threshold and declare itself a nuclear weapon state.
Let's fast forward to 2004 now. Obviously, the Cold Start Doctrine, we're talking about conventional warfare now. So, India believes that they can actually initiate punitive strikes on Pakistani territory, quick mobilization. There's been a lot of talk about it in that particular time frame. We've also had many seminars and conferences in the think tank community in Pakistan suddenly being alarmed by the CSD. How practical is the CSD given that India is a nuclear weapon state and Pakistan's response has been to deploy tactical nuclear weapons on the ground? So, when we talk about CSD in general, do you think it's more of, because India is facing insurgencies in Jharkhand, we talk about the Maoist insurgency, India is facing, the Khalistan problem, which has become more of a profound problem. But even though the insurgency wasn't that profound in 2004, it was still simmering in Punjab. So is it really practical to adopt such doctrines to try and engulf Pakistan?
One of the lessons that was learned during Cold War, that nuclear weapon states, they don't go to war with each other because the consequences are too serious for the region and for the world also.
Absolutely, yeah.
We learned that lessons from the Cold War, but India probably, since it had that conventional superiority against Pakistan, they continue to deny this fact, and their military, they continue to think about several war fighting doctrines, Gold Star doctrine that you mentioned, and it has evolved into surgical strikes also, and then aerial surgical strike
Right,
in 2019 also. But the basic principle in that Gold Star doctrine was that since both India and Pakistan cannot go to an all-out war, because of the consequences of a nuclear exchange or the possibility of a nuclear exchange. So India should find a space for limited military operation against Pakistan. As their conception or their military leadership thought that if they carry out limited strikes against Pakistan, uh, probably Pakistan would be self-deterred from using its strategic weapons against their major cities, because that would be a disproportionate response against a limited strike. So they thought they have a space for that. So they developed that thinking. They developed their cantonments all along international border. They reconfigured their strike formations into small integrated battle groups. So that's how they wanted to operationalize it. But then Pakistan introduced these short-range ballistic missiles, missiles that are also known as tactical nuclear weapons.
TNWs, yeah.
Yes, to give this message that there is no space for any kind of conflict between two nuclear weapon states, not even a limited military operation.
Operation, right.
So many people think that probably we have moved towards nuclear war fighting, which is factually incorrect, and that is due to lack of understanding. The whole purpose of introducing these short-range ballistic missiles or the tactical nuclear weapons was to plug that perceived gap. I insist on perceived gap because that was the perception on the Indian side. From our side, there was no misperception that there's a gap. The Indian military thinkers, they thought they can probably get away with a limited kind of military operation. So by introducing those short-range ballistic missiles or the tactical nuclear weapons, the message was that we have covered the entire spectrum of threats, starting from limited to an all-out war to the strategic. So we had tactical nuclear weapons and also the strategic weapons. So there's no space for any war between the two countries. That frustrated Indian planners, and that is how,
Right.
despite introducing this, despite investing billions of dollars in this reconfiguration of their strike formations since 2004, it's been almost 19 years. They couldn't
Yes.
operationalize their cold start doctrine.
Right.
Subsequently, they relabeled it as proactive operations strategy also. And in 2016, they claimed that they had launched limited ground-based surgical strike. And in 2019, we saw the aerial surgical strike, and we saw the consequence also. But the fact that their whole planning or the doctrinal thinking was in a way checkmated by this conceptual planning or the introduction of these short-range ballistic missiles from the Pakistani side to cover that entire spectrum. That's why we continue to say, from the Pakistani side, that nuclear weapon states, they don't go to war with each other. Even a limited military conflict can quickly escalate into an all-out war, and it can lead to a nuclear war also, which would have serious consequences for the region and for the global security.
Okay, so when let's talk about the Narendra Modi government now. So we're talking about an aggressive Hindu masculine sort of ideology where, minorities are supposed to be subjugated to second-class citizens, and Hindutva is also being exported. We saw what happened with, India's foreign policy towards its smaller neighbors in Nepal and Bhutan and elsewhere. And obviously with Pakistan, you do have that aggressive sort of, doctrinal principle where they basically believe that Pakistan could be wiped off the map both through international isolation and also through military buildups. But during this time period, ever since the Modi government has come into power, this is the second term, there have been calls by certain Indian politicians claiming that we don't need an NFU or a nuclear first use policy. So, and then obviously you've also caught uranium being transported in local markets within India as well. I want you to elaborate on that story too. So, obviously, with Modi in power, the nuclear non-proliferation regime would be under threat.
The recent trend of militant nationalism that has emerged in India, where this right wing or the extremist mindset that has been, in a way, hyphenated with the nationalism, that is a dangerous phenomena if we see, because it is seeping into decision making level within the military also and the
Right.
political leadership
And the political
also.
leadership. Right.
And the political leaders or the politicians, where they find it as valuable for their own domestic political interest. And that's how you continue to see that anti-Pakistan sentiments being used for domestic politics. And since this is paying them dividends, this phenomena is increasing. The more number of people, even the military, top military leadership, now they're also embarking on the same kind of populism, where they use these kind of rhetoric, gel with their extremist mindset to target Pakistan based on ideology and based on that Pakistan is an adversary and everything that is happening wrong in India is because of Pakistan. It might have some short-term dividends but for the long term, it is polarizing Indian society. India is a huge country that prided itself, that used to take pride in this secularism and democracy.
All right.
But if you ingrain these kind of sentiments at the public level, then it would become very, very difficult for any political leadership in the future to bring that kind of unity that is essential for India to survive and continue to grow. This is going to adversely impact Indian national polity, but that's their country. They have to take decision. From a Pakistani perspective, yes, this is dangerous, because we have been dealing with a country as an adversary, with which we had territorial disputes and disagreements, and we tried to have a bilateral dialogue also, or try to resolve it militarily.
Which was rejected by Modi time and time again.
Yeah. But now these trends that are emerging, now if you bring in a nuclear capability and extremist mindset together,
Yeah.
that becomes extremely dangerous, because you don't know who would be having that control over the button and what kind of mindset he or she has towards the adversary. So in nuclear brinkmanship, that's a very dangerous game because once we talk about nuclear strategy, we talk about rational actors.
Right.
So if the other side is irrational and ready to take certain irrational actions, so you have to prepare for every kind of contingency. We saw in 2019, nobody trusted Modi that he is going to use nuclear weapons, but the kind of rhetoric that he adopted or used against Pakistan, and that these are not for the fireworks, and we might use nuclear weapons against Pakistan,
Right.
implicitly implying that, and mobilizing the missiles, just because he was humiliated because during that tit for tat kind of a response from the Pakistani Air Force.
Yeah, and
with
it
the
was
two
a very
aircraft.
graceful
Yeah,
response. Let's be very
yeah.
fair. I mean, we returned the pilot, and it was good for diplomacy. Even Indian commentators were claiming that Pakistan's response was more mature and measured.
Absolutely, both at the military level, at the political level
Right.
also, because we demonstrated restraint. We could have gone beyond
that,
and we were justified also because India was an aggressor, and whatever we could have done, it was in the defense of the country. But we demonstrated that responsibility and restraint because both countries are nuclear weapon state, and if things get out of control, it can quickly escalate into a serious crisis. The famous 44-rung Herman Khan's letter doesn't work in South Asia.
Right, doesn't.
Especially if you have people like Modi, who are very sentimental, emotional, and they love to use that emotional card or the religious card to portray their adversary as negative, and they can even use this nuclear rhetoric to just for the domestic politics. So in that kind of environment, it becomes a very dangerous game. Now, coming back to your point about the India's doctrinal evolution, the no
And
first
also
use.
about the traces of uranium that was actually found in a few Indian marketplaces. It was pretty much commonplace. It's
Yeah.
also been reported in general. So if you can
Okay.
elaborate on that too.
I will. First, talking about the doctrinal shift. Uh, since we have introduced these solutions to India's cold start or proactive operations doctrine, Indian military, they feel frustrated that they're spending almost $70 billion against a relatively smaller country, which can only spend 11 to $12 billion annually on its conventional spending. Still, the nuclear deterrence gives them this potential to maintain that strategic stability in this region. So, for India, being a larger country which wants to project itself as a regional hegemon and a potential global power, this is frustrating.
Right.
The other neighbors, they accept, they are ready to, I won't say on their behalf, but as we see the kind of attitude that India has towards its other smaller neighbors, they probably have no other choice but to accept the ground reality. Pakistan is not ready to accept that. So that's frustrating for Indian military planners. And several people have argued that India should give up on its no first use posture,
Right.
which nobody, not in Pakistan, nobody believed that no first use posture because it's not a legal treaty or something. And the way Indian statements have been coming there, Rajnath Singh, he's incumbent defense minister,
Right.
Manoj Parrikar, who was the former
Even
defense
Amit Shah,
minister.
I think you once he also
Amit Shah, I don't remember, but
yeah, in
I'm
a
sure
rally he did.
He would have done.
Yeah.
But several of the senior military leadership, General Bagal, who was the head of the Strategic Forces Command, and Shiv Shankar Menon, in his book in Choices, he wrote that they can possibly go for first use. So all these things, and remember, they are part of their nuclear decision-making circle. So if these statements come from them, so as an adversary, you have to take those statements very seriously, that probably there is some internal thinking going on. For political reasons, they continue to say that they will not be the first to use nuclear weapons against. And
so there's a disconnect here.
There is a disconnect at many levels in their doctrinal position and what they are building in actually. But that's a separate debate.
Right.
Because they continue to say credible minimum deterrence, but they're also building ICBMs. So 8,000, 10,000, that goes beyond China. So that doesn't fit in their credible minimum deterrence and triad and all those things. But on this no first use, I think that's a very serious concern. As an adversary, you have to take those statements and you have to take corrective actions to deal with that situation if and when something happens with the future crisis. But coming to the proliferation, we started with this Canadian supplied research reactor. So that was the first uh, incident of proliferation from the Indian side. As a matter of fact, all countries have proliferated. The Manhattan Project was a result of proliferation. It was never an indigenous program. The subsequently Soviets, they also benefited from the Manhattan
Yes,
Project.
they did. Right.
The French, they benefited from the Manhattan Project. The Chinese also got something from Soviets, and UK got it from the United States. So all countries have
Everyone was
proliferated
benefiting
further.
from it. Right.
But from the Indian side, what is problematic is that the episodes or these trends where the uranium ore is being exported or smuggled out of India. So that has uh, consequences for the region because somebody out there is buying this.
Right. Right.
So there is an international network.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
If there was no demand, there wouldn't be any supply. And the kind of the safeguards arrangement that India has, but because it says that it has safeguarded and unsafeguarded, but it's a huge complex in India. And the fissile material production has enormously increased since India-US nuclear deal because United States helped India on the civilian side and everything which was being used for the military and civil both. Now it is being used purely for military.
So that's resulted in mushrooming of growth.
Absolutely. The controls over the safety and security issues have raised. And you mentioned something about the Nuclear Threat Initiative recent report.
Right.
In that report also, India stands below Pakistan. So what India has been telling the world that it is a very responsible nuclear weapon state or nuclear state. The NTI index and other reports, the nuclear smuggling reports, they all indicate to a different trend or trajectory, which is problematic as a neighbor.
So when we talk about India being, I mean, you provided evidence to suggest that India is not a responsible nuclear weapon state. But when we talk, why is the international community silent? I mean, we've heard this, rhetoric time and time again. India is a large market; they can get away with murder. But frankly speaking, with the nuclear non-proliferation record and nuclear non-proliferation regime being so sacrosanct in the Western world, it's almost time to call India's bluff. Why do you think the international community has been teetering on that account?
You use the right word. India can get away with a murder, and this is what is happening in Canada. And eventually you would see, because the major powers, their focus or they are so much fixated on this anti-China alliance that they can, India can get away with any kind of murder and they would look towards the other side. They know India's nuclear development and how the malpractice, the safety and security issues. The 1998 test itself, immediately after, India should have been sanctioned because it introduced nuclear weapons in South Asia, but it was rewarded in the context of India-US strategic partnership.
Right.
And that's how India-US nuclear deal came in. And then India was being accommodated in the export control regime also, notwithstanding the track record that India has.
Right.
But India was made part of all the three export control regime minus the nuclear suppliers group where Pakistan stood on principles. And United States, despite all its political capital, could not make or accommodate India into the nuclear suppliers group. That's what realpolitik is. If you are required and you agree to serve the interest of the major powers, you can get away with anything, and India is one shining example of this realpolitik in these days.
Dean of the Aerospace Sciences Strategic Studies Department at Air University, Dr. Adil Sultan, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
That's all that we have from IPRI's podcast. I'm Hamza Rifat Hussain. You just witnessed an engaging conversation, and what is very clear from this conversation is, based on facts and based on evidence, that India is not a responsible nuclear weapons state. Do provide us with your comments. Until next time, take care.